team that thinks that giving more people guns in Somalia is probably not a good thing for conflict. At no point in Richard's speech did we support the arming of local militia groups. What we said was that we thought that that was something that NGOs might have to resort to once they've excluded all of the legitimate contractors because they all committed abuses. And what we also said was that we're happy for NGOs to have positive working relationships with military groups that we otherwise hate, like the Al-Shabaab, because we think that that is a much better way to deliver aid to areas that they control, rather than just going in there with men with guns. So, today I have 4 things that I'm going to talk about. The first thing is what the impact of private military contractors has on aid delivery, because we heard some fairly ineffective responses from the second speaker of the affirmative to what Richard brought you. So the first issue is whether they'll be shut out of areas that are controlled by groups like the Al-Shabaab. And we had some pretty glib responses about how, like, we're already shut out of these areas and how it doesn't really make any difference. But, like, this is pretty glib because it fails to engage with a number of layers of Richard's analysis. The first is that, like, having military contractors, generally speaking, in areas that are troubled like Somalia, undermines the trust between groups like the Al-Shabaab and between NGO aid givers to continue to give aid in an apolitical fashion that has the purpose only of humanitarian goals rather than broader political goals. We think that even if private military contractors aren't used in specific areas that, like, the Al-Shabaab wants to let NGOs in, that doesn't mean that it doesn't change the perception of NGOs, and in so doing undermine their capacity to go to those areas that are controlled by these militant groups. Furthermore, we think that there are areas that are dangerous that we can currently access and that NGOs are willing to risk accessing, which we will be shut out of once that risk is reduced. So we think that the opposition's model has a major effect in drastically reducing the amount of areas that we will practically be able to access with private military contractors. We also think that more broadly it will undermine trust between the West and these kinds of countries, because there'll be a perception of, like, neo-colonialism when you have a whole lot of men with guns from Blackwater arriving on the Horn of Africa. We think that means that you have a very visible metaphor and a very visible indication of, like, a foreign occupying force, and we think that that will also help undermine those kinds of relationships that are important for organisations like the Red Cross being able to get into these kinds of conflict zones in Gaza or Somalia or wherever. Okay, so the second issue that Richard talked about was how these groups wouldn't actually be, private military contractors wouldn't actually be effective because they would be able to be ambushed by locals or alternatively there'd be loyalty issues. The response we had from the second was pretty glib. She said that they'll just attack these people anyway because they're an alternative power base. And we've got 2 responses to this. Firstly, clearly you're more of a power base if you have guns. And secondly, we think what we were saying was that because PMCs don't actually have the effect of guaranteeing security, all they will do is bring all these other harms about relationships between militant groups and Western NGOs, and not actually have any real practical effect on ensuring that NGOs can deliver secure aid to these people in these conflict zones. Okay, and this final point that we heard no response to whatsoever was this stuff that I've already touched on about how it will undermine perceptions of the West and therefore the relationship between people in these conflict zones and Western NGOs. Okay, so the second issue that I'm going to talk about is accountability. Because we've heard right down the affirmative bench about how NGOs have these wonderful incentives to enforce proper standards on private military contractors. And we didn't tell you that that was wrong, but we told you that they don't have the capacity to enforce to prevent atrocities from occurring from private military contractors, because they occur in a heated battle as a result of the poor judgment and, like, restricted judgment of individuals. And we saw that kind of thing in Iraq, in a situation where there was extensive oversight by an accountable national government and in a part of the world that was, like, crawling with journalists. How bad is it going to get when we're talking about, like, godforsaken parts of Somalia that no one can access because they'll get killed by the Al-Shabaab? And then we had this interesting point about how, like, oh, like, it's just that the soldiers are, like, confused and don't know what they're doing in these countries. Like, we think that's probably pretty wrong, that, like, people are smart enough to give proper instructions to private military contractors. But we also think that it has no effect whatsoever on the judgment of individuals that is actually what occurs when we're talking about accountability. We've also never had any response to the fact that there isn't necessarily an incentive to report those kinds of atrocities from either the NGOs or the contractors, or the fact that the NGOs might not know about it, and therefore that it's just the contractors and their commercial incentives that is between, like, accountability and preventing these kinds of abuses. It only requires one slip-up to ensure that, like, the confidence in Western NGOs is undermined, and also to ensure that, like, the West generally has a bad rep in these kinds of countries in a really destructive way. Then we heard about how states don't have incentives to ensure accountability. We think that's rubbish. We think that when you look at something like Abu Ghraib or the Blackwater Massacre, you see that the Western states have an enormous incentive to to ensure that those kinds of atrocities never happen because of the incredibly destructive impact they have on their international relations and the impact that has on their particular areas of conflict. Okay, so finally with regard to rebuttal, I'm going to discuss about whether states are a better alternative to aid organisations in these kinds of conflict zones. And so we heard right down the affirmative bench, mostly from First, about how states have political goals and issues that prevent entry and all that kind of thing. We don't agree with this because it ignores the role of international institutions like the United Nations, and we haven't had an adequate response to this because we think the United Nations is an extremely broad and extremely well-resourced mission to ensure that everyone on Earth has some modicum of food security. We think that when they look at something like a famine in Somalia, they have a large incentive and they actually achieve the ability to deploy forces there to ensure that those people get food. We think that that's much better than private military contractors because it's accountable to international law norms and because it has a degree of legitimacy, because it's not a foreign occupying force with a perceived political agenda. It's a clearly impartial force that's running around with blue helmets to tell everyone that that's the case. We also think there are other institutions that have similar levels of legitimacy, for example, the African Union, which has a major role in distributing aid in Somalia. Then we also have that states tend to destroy infrastructure, and we just think that's factually incorrect. We think that when you have an American force helicoptering into Darfur, largely what they're helicoptering in is not like predator drones, it's like aid baskets. And so we just didn't really buy that kind of analysis because it was sort of more of an Afghanistan scenario than a Darfur scenario, and missed the point of what this debate is actually about. Okay, so I've got one point of some standard, and it's about how military contractors are bad in principle. What the opposition's model is, it expands the scope of military contractors' operations by giving them a vastly larger amount of areas in the world where they operate in a vastly larger group of potential clientele. What that means is that we obviously have a larger private military contractor industry. More NGOs are hiring them, they're going to more parts of the world. So why is this bad? Well, it's bad for two reasons. The first reason is that we think that it is bad for there to be more people employed by private military contractors. That is because those people are exploited. By and large, they are poor people, often ex-military people from poor parts of the United States who are joining those organisations because they're broadly hopeless, they don't have prospects in life. That's why they're agreeing to be sent out to these obscure parts of the world. The reason why they're the only people who want these jobs is because they're incredibly risky, and because unlike the conventional military, they don't have the same healthcare benefits, the same counselling benefits, and the same general welfare retirement benefits as proper soldiers. These people are being exploited to, they're being lied to, and they're being told that the war isn't as bad as it really is. And we think that's really bad. It's something that we're opposed to. The second reason why the private military contractors are always bad, and why we want to restrict their expansion as much as possible, is because the military-industrial complex will expand if they expand, giving more private incentives in the context of the American political system to engage in acts of conflict in order to support the private arms industry. We think that's something that is really bad. So because we've shown you about exactly why private military contractors drastically undermine the capacity of aid organisations to give aid to people in conflict zones, and because we've shown you about how they're not really effective at delivering aid anyway, we're very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Tom for his speech and call upon the third affirmative speaker, Chris.